the second round now of questioning. Congressman Roma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having served on the joint inquiry, the only person of this 9/11 panel to have served on the inquiry, I can say in open session to some of Mr. Fielding's inquiries that as the joint inquiry asked for information on the National Security Council, and we requested that the National Security Advisor, Dr. Rice, come before the joint inquiry and answer those questions, she refused. And she didn't come. She didn't come before the 9/11 Commission. And when we asked for some questions to be answered, Mr. Hadley answered those questions in a written form. So I think part of the answer might be that we didn't have access to the January 25th memo. We didn't have access to the September 4th memo. We didn't have access to many of the documents and the emails. We're not only talking about Mr. Clarke being before the 9/11 Commission for more than 15 hours, but I think in talking to the staff, we have hundreds of documents and emails that we didn't previously have, which hopefully informs us to ask Mr. Clarke and ask Dr. Rice the tough questions. And I have some more tough questions for you, Mr. Clarke. On the FBI, you've said that the FBI did not do a very good job. I think I'm paraphrasing you in much easier language than you've used, but that during the millennium, which may be the exception to the rule, they performed extremely well in sharing information. How do we get the FBI to do this on a regular basis? We still have problems here today. Or is that not an option for us? We don't have time, Mr. Clarke. I mean, I appreciate everybody going after everybody in Washington, D.C. We don't have time to make these kinds of arguments and attacks if we're going to get this situation right in the future in this country and prevent, or hopefully prevent, the next one, when we do know something for certain, and that is that groups like Al-Qaeda want to get dirty bombs, they want to get chemical and biological weapons, and they want to come after America. So how do we get this situation solved, Mr. Clarke? What do we do with the FBI? What's your recommendation?
In a perfect world, I believe we could create a domestic intelligence service that would have sufficient oversight that it would not infringe on our civil liberties. In a perfect world, I would create that domestic intelligence service separately from the FBI. In the world in which we live, I think that would be a difficult step to go directly to. And so what I proposed instead is that we create a domestic intelligence service within the FBI, and as fast as we could, develop it into an autonomous agency. I'm very fearful that such an agency would have potential to infringe on our civil liberties, and therefore I think we would have to take extraordinary steps to have active oversight of such an agency. And we'd have to explain to the American people in a very compelling way why they needed a domestic intelligence service, because I think most Americans would be fearful of a secret police in the United States. But frankly, the FBI culture, the FBI organization, the FBI personnel are not the best we could do in this country for a domestic intelligence service.
We will certainly be looking to people in future hearings for their recommendations in a host of different areas. So I hope that you might think through this area a little bit more and be available to us. Mr. Clarke, let me ask you some difficult questions for you to get at the complexity of our relationship with the Saudis. On the one hand, I think it's fairly there's a great deal of unanimity that the Saudis were not doing everything they could before 9/11 to help us in a host of different areas, that 15 of the 19 hijackers came from there, that we had trouble tracking some of the financing for terrorist operations, that we still have too many of the madrasas and the teachings of hatred of Christians and Jews and others coming out of some of these madrasas. We need to broaden and deepen this relationship. I will ask you a Part A and a Part B. Part A is, where do we go in this difficult relationship? And Part B is to further look at the difficulty here. You made a decision after 9/11 to, I think, and I'd like to ask you more about this, to allow a plane of Saudis to fly out of the country. And when most other planes were grounded, this plane flew from the United States back to Saudi Arabia. I'd like to know why you made that decision, who was on this plane, and if the FBI ever had the opportunity to interview those people.
You're absolutely right that the Saudi Arabian government did not cooperate with us significantly in the fight against terrorism prior to 9/11. Indeed, it didn't really cooperate until after bombs blew up in Riyadh. Now, as to this controversy about the Saudi evacuation aircraft, let me tell you everything I know, which is that in the days following 9/11, whether it was on 9/12 or 9/15, I can't tell you, we were in a constant crisis management meeting that had started the morning of 9/11 and ran for days on end. We were making lots of decisions, but we were coordinating them with all the agencies through the video teleconference procedure. Someone, and I wish I could tell you who, but I don't know who, someone brought to that group a proposal that we authorize a request from the Saudi embassy. The Saudi embassy had apparently said that they feared for the lives of Saudi citizens because they thought there would be retribution against Saudis in the United States as it became obvious to Americans that this attack was essentially done by Saudis. And that there were even Saudi citizens in the United States who were part of the bin Laden family, which is a very large family, very large family. The Saudi embassy therefore asked for these people to be evacuated. The same sort of thing that we do all the time in similar crises, evacuating Americans. The request came to me and I refused to approve it. I suggested that it be routed to the FBI and that the FBI look at the names of the individuals who are going to be on the passenger manifest and that they approve it or not. I spoke with the, at that time, the number 2 person in the FBI, Dale Watson, and asked him to deal with this issue. The FBI then approved, after some period of time, and I can't tell you how long, approved the flight. Now, what degree of review the FBI did of those names, I cannot tell you. How many people there are on the plane, I cannot tell you. But I have asked since, were there any individuals on that flight that in retrospect the FBI wishes they could have interviewed in this country? And the answer I've been given is no. That there was no one who left on that flight who the FBI now wants to interview.
Despite the fact that we don't know if Dale Watson interviewed them in the first place.
I don't think they were ever interviewed in this country.
Do we know, so they were not interviewed here. We have all their names. We don't know if there has been any follow-up to interview those people that were here and flown out of the country.
The last time I asked that question, I was informed that the FBI still had no desire to interview any of these people.
Would you have a desire to interview some of these people that asked?
I don't know who they are.
We don't know who they are.
I don't know who they are. The FBI knew who they were because they had...
Given your confidence in your statements on the FBI, what's your level of comfort with this?
Well, I will tell you in particular about the ones that get the most attention here in the press, and they are members of the bin Laden family.
Okay.
I was aware for some time that there were members of the bin Laden family living in the United States. And let's see, in open session I can say that I was very well aware of the members of the bin Laden family and what they were doing in the United States. And the FBI was extraordinarily well aware of what they were doing in the United States. And I was informed by the FBI that none of the members of the bin Laden family, this large clan, were doing anything in this country that was illegal or that raised their suspicions. And I believe the FBI had very good information and good sources of information about what the members of the bin Laden family were doing.
I've been very impressed with your memory sitting through all these interviews that the 9/11 Commission has conducted with you. I press you again to try to recall how this request originated. Who might have passed this on to you at the White House Situation Room, or who might have originated that request for the United States government to fly out? How many people on this plane?
I don't know.
We don't know how many people were on a plane that flew out of this country. Who gave the final approval then to say, yes, you're clear to go, it's all right with the United States government to go to Saudi Arabia?
I believe after the FBI came back and said it was all right with them, we ran it through the decision process for all of these decisions that we were making in those hours, which was the Interagency Crisis Management Group on the video conference. I was making or coordinating a lot of decisions on 9/11 and in the days immediately after. And I would love to be able to tell you who did it, who brought this proposal to me, but I don't know. The two, since you press me, the two possibilities that are most likely are either the Department of State or the White House Chief of Staff's office. But I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Gotten.
One more question on that subject. When the approvals were finally made and when the flight left, was the flight embargo still in effect, or were we flying, or was that over? Were we flying once again?
No, sir. No, Senator. The reason that a decision was needed was because the flight embargo, the grounding, was still in effect.
Okay. We talked a little bit in my earlier round of questioning about this frustrating phrase, actionable intelligence. And one of your recommendations to the new administration, according to our staff report, was to choose a standard of evidence for attributing responsibility for the coal and deciding on a response. Did that express a frustration that you had for the previous several years, that the phrase actionable intelligence often seemed to be an excuse for people not doing anything, that perhaps they had other reasons for not wanting to do? Did you want a broader definition, either of how much intelligence one needed or how broad action should be?
Yes.
Yes to both?
Yes to both.
Okay. Could you tell me, what your previous frustrations had been and what kind of test you would have imposed?
Well, I think if you go back to 1993, when the attempted assassination on the first President Bush occurred in Kuwait, the process we put in place then was to ask the FBI, working with Secret Service, to develop a set of evidence, and CIA to develop separately an intelligence case. And that took from February of '93 through the end of May. And it was done in a way that was reminiscent of a criminal process. At least the FBI case was. The CIA case was an intelligence case and had different sources of information, different standards for what was admissible, and a more lenient standard for making a determination. But I think beginning then, I was frustrated by that kind of evidentiary process. Now, I heard Sandy Berger this morning point out that immediately following the Pan Am 103 terrorist attack, the assumption in the intelligence and law enforcement communities was that it was a Syrian attack. And I recall that. He's quite right. And it turned out not to be a Syrian attack. He pointed out that in the days and weeks after the TWA 800 crash, we assumed it was a terrorist attack. There were eyewitnesses of what appeared to be a missile attack. But after exhaustive investigations that went on for years in the case of the NTSB and the FBI, a determination was made that it was not a terrorist attack. And I believe that that is the accurate determination. Mr. Berger made other examples, Oklahoma City and whatnot. I think we have to distinguish between rushing to judgment after a terrorist event, which, as Mr. Berger said, is a mistake, because sometimes the evidence changes, sometimes the evidence develops. We saw this in Spain just 2 weeks ago, where for the first day after the attacks in Madrid, the evidence really looked like it was the Basque separatist group. And I know there are political charges against the Spanish government for having distorted intelligence, but there was a lot of intelligence the first day that suggested it was the Basque terrorist group. So we do need to be careful not to rush to judgment after a terrorist attack. On the other hand, what I was suggesting in that paper that you referred to, is that we not necessarily have to wait for a terrorist attack in order to attack a terrorist group. But when you sometimes do that, you get into trouble. President Clinton got into a lot of trouble, a lot of criticism, for blowing up a chemical plant in Sudan. To this day, there are a lot of people who believe that it was not related to a terrorist group, not related to chemical weapons. They're wrong, by the way. But the president had decided in PDD 39 that there should be a low threshold of evidence when it comes to the possibility of terrorists getting their hands on chemical weapons. And he acted on that basis, and when he acted on that basis, he and his advisors were all heavily criticized. So what I was suggesting there, and what I am suggesting here now, is that while Sandy Berger is right, and we should not rush to judgment after a terrorist attack as to who did it until there is ample intelligence evidence, not criminal evidence. On the other hand, we should feel free to attack terrorist groups without waiting for them to attack us if we make a policy and an intelligence judgment that they pose a threat.
One follow-up question on that. Between January and September of 2001, was there any actionable intelligence under either the narrow or broader definition that caused you to recommend an immediate military response to some provocation?
I suggested, beginning in January of 2001, that the Cole case was still out there, and that by now, in January of 2001, CIA had finally gotten around to saying it was an al-Qaeda attack, and that therefore there was an open issue which should be decided about whether or not the Bush administration should retaliate for the Cole attack. Unfortunately, there was no interest, no acceptance of that proposition, and I was told on a couple of occasions, well, that that happened on the Clinton administration's watch. I didn't think it made any difference. I thought the Bush administration, now that it had the CIA saying it was al-Qaeda, should have responded.
But there was no other January to September incident that caused you to recommend a military response, I gather.
In the general definition, I think there was. What we had discussed in the general definition was not waiting for the terrorist attack, but feeling free to use military activity or covert action activity, it doesn't have to be military, covert action activity as a way of taking the offensive against terrorist organizations that look like they threaten the United States. And what our plan or strategy or list of options included was covert action activity to be taken to go on the offensive against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
Through surrogates or through direct intervention?
That was a combination of both, but it was the determination of how that would be structured would be left to the CIA.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kerry?
Well, Mr. Clarke, let me say at the beginning that everything that you've said today and done has not damaged my view of your integrity. It's very much intact as far as I'm concerned, and I hope that your pledge earlier not to be a part of the Kerry administration did not preclude you from coming to New York sometime and teaching at the New School. So,
In the Kerry administration.
and let me also say this document of Fox News earlier, this transcript that they have, this is a background briefing. And all of us that have provided background briefings for the press before should beware. I mean, Fox should say occasionally fair and balanced after putting something like this out, because they violated a serious trust. All of us that come into this kind of an environment and provide background briefings for the press, I think will always have this as a reminder that sometimes it isn't going to happen, that it's background. Sometimes, if it suits their interest, they're going to go back, pull the tape, convert it into transcript, and send it out in the public arena and try to embarrass us or discredit us. So I object to what they've done, and I think it's an unfortunate thing they did. Let me say as well that you and I have some disagreements, and I'm going to get into them. First of all, I do not want to go back to the bad old days when covert operations could be done in an environment where the people thought they could do something in violation of U.S. law, or that they come to Congress and lie about it, thinking that that was okay. I mean, that's what we were directing our attention to. Perhaps there were some personnel mistakes that were made in the response to the problems in Guatemala in particular. But I don't want to go back to the bad old days where guys could go out there and operate and not have to worry about U.S. law, and not have to worry about whether or not they came and lied to Congress.
No, nor do I, Senator.
And secondly, I don't see it as you do that the war in Iraq has increased the threat of terrorism. I honestly don't, unless you say that the threat of terrorism in Iraq has unquestionably gone up as a consequence of al-Qaeda feeling even more opposition to freedom in Iraq than they do in freedom in the United States. They feel much more threatened by having an Arab democracy than they do by having a democracy in the United States. And so I don't see it that way. And though I don't go as far as the administration has done with drawing the connection to al-Qaeda, I do think that the presence of Abdul Rahman Yassim in Iraq certainly causes some suspicions to be raised. And I wonder, and I presume you know who Abdul Rahman Yassim is, and I wonder if you could comment on that. I mean, what conclusions do you draw by the fact that we have an individual who we believe was a part of the conspiracy to attack the World Trade Center in the World Trade Center 1 in February of 1993, an associate of Ramzi Youssef, who was connected at least indirectly to the second attack. I wonder what conclusions you draw from the fact that Yassim has been given, at the very least, a place that he could hang out, and he's on the lam again. And we're still hunting him and trying to find out where he is in Iraq today.
Let me go back into the history of 1993, which is when we first heard about this man. In 1993, when the truck bomb exploded at the World Trade Center, we didn't know there was an al-Qaeda. No one had ever said that. And the initial reports, and I mean initial by the sense of about a year or two, the initial reports from the FBI's investigation of that attack, suggested that the attackers were somehow a gang of people from 5 or 6 different countries who had found each other and come together, almost like a pickup basketball team, that there was no organization behind it. Eventually, in retrospect, the FBI and CIA were able to discover that there was an organization behind it, and that organization is what we now call al-Qaeda. most of the people directly involved in that conspiracy were identified and tracked down by the FBI and CIA and arrested or snatched and brought back to the United States. Mr. Yersin was the one who wasn't. And the reason he wasn't was he was an Iraqi. He was the only Iraqi in the group. There were Egyptians, there were other nationalities. He was an Iraqi, and therefore, when the explosion took place and he fled the United States, he went back to Iraq. And we were obviously, for obvious reasons, unable to either snatch him or get him to be extradited to the United States. But the investigation, both the CIA investigation and the FBI investigation, made it very clear in 95 and 96, as they got more information, that the Iraqi government was in no way involved in that attack. And the fact that one of the 12 people involved in the attack was Iraqi hardly seems to me as evidence that that the Iraqi government was involved in the attack. The attack was al-Qaeda, not Iraq. The Iraqi government, because obviously of the hostility between us and them, didn't cooperate in turning him over and gave him sanctuary, as it did give sanctuary to other terrorists. But the allegation that has been made that the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center was done by the Iraqi government, I think, is absolutely without foundation.
Can you see where a reasonable person might say that if Yassim is given a safe haven inside of Iraq prior to 9/11, that the Iraqis are at least unwilling to do what is necessary to bring someone that we believe is responsible for killing Americans in 1993 to justice?
Well, the Iraqis were, absolutely, the Iraqis were providing safe haven to a variety of Palestinian terrorists as well. Absolutely. As were the Iranians, as were the Syrians.
Thank you.
Commissioner Benveniste.
I just wanted to say that having sat in on 2 days of debriefings with you, Mr. Clarke, and having seen excerpts from your book, other than questions you weren't asked, I have not perceived any substantive differences between what you have said to us and what has been quoted from your published work. Having said that, I'll cede my time to Congressman Romer if he'll give me his time with Condoleezza Rice.
That may not be a
Submit
good
those
deal.
questions for the record, Mr. Commissioner.
Is that all?
Chairman.
Commissioner Thompson?
Mr. Clarke, in this background briefing, as Senator Kerry has now described it for the press in August of 2002, you intended to mislead the press, did you not?
No. I think there's a very fine line that anyone who's been in the White House in any administration can tell you about. And that is, when you are Special Assistant to the President and you're asked to explain something that is potentially embarrassing to the administration because the administration didn't do enough or didn't do it in a timely manner and is taking political heat for it, as was the case there, you have a choice. Actually, I think you have three choices. You can resign rather than do it. I chose not to do that. Second choice is...
Why was that, Mr. Clarke? You finally resigned because you were frustrated?
I was, at that time, at the request of the President, preparing a national strategy to defend America's cyberspace, something which I thought then and think now is vitally important. I thought that completing that strategy was a lot more important than whether or not I had to provide emphasis in one place or other while discussing the facts of this particular news story. The second choice one has, Governor, is whether or not to say things that are untruthful. And no one in the Bush White House asked me to say things that were untruthful, and I would not have said them in any event. The third choice that one has is to put the best face you can for the administration on the facts as they were, and that is what I did. And I think that is what most people in the White House, in any administration, do when they're asked to explain something that is embarrassing to the administration.
But you will admit that what you said in August of 2002 is inconsistent with what you say in your book.
No, I don't think it's inconsistent at all. I think, as I said in your last round of questioning, Governor, that it's really a matter here of emphasis and tone, and that it's really, I mean, what you're suggesting perhaps is that as Special Assistant to the President of the United States, when asked to give a press backgrounder, I should spend my time in that press backgrounder criticizing him. I think that's somewhat of an unrealistic thing to expect.
But what it suggests to me is that there is one standard of candor and morality for White House special assistants and another standard of candor and morality for the rest of America. I don't get that.
I don't think it's a question of morality at all. I think it's a question of politics.
Well, I'm not a Washington insider. I've never been a special assistant in the White House. I'm from the Midwest, so I think I'll leave it there.
Congressman Roma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your patience. This has been, I'm sure, a long day for you, Mr. Clarke. I want to explore a little bit more, since we've heard from Mr. Tennant on this issue today, the predator issue. As you know, the predator first came out of use in Kosovo, and it was used in various activities with a laser on it to track Serb tanks, to help us go after those tanks. It was flown in 2000 in the Clinton administration as a recon vehicle, unmanned recon vehicle. In 2001, we had a debate, a complex debate that I can understand both sides of. It took several months to try to resolve it. There are two issues here, on the recon predator and on the armed predator. Mr. Tennant said that they were not blocking the armed predator. You have said that they were blocking the armed predator. How do we reconcile these two? And please take us through a little bit of this. I want to ask you if it would have made much of a difference getting the unarmed up, and if the armed could have been put up earlier than October of 2001.
Let me begin in the first few months of the year 2000. President Clinton was enormously frustrated because he had authorized, in effect, the assassination of bin Laden and his lieutenants by CIA. He had also authorized, in principle, the use of military forces, cruise missiles, to attack and kill bin Laden and his lieutenants. And none of this had happened because the CIA had been unable to use its human intelligence resources in Afghanistan to provide, I'm sorry, Senator, actionable intelligence. On the occasions when we had things that looked like actionable intelligence, the 3 or 4 occasions, the director of CIA himself said the intelligence wasn't good enough. So the president was very mad, and he asked Sandy Berger and me to come up with a better way. I asked the director of the Joint Staff, Admiral Fry, and the associate DCI, Charlie Allen, to form a task force to come up with a better way. They proposed flying the Predator in Afghanistan. CIA's Directorate of Operations, the director of the Directorate of Operations, opposed the use of Predator in 2000 for reconnaissance purposes. He said that if there were additional resources available to pay for the Predator operation, he would prefer to use them on human intelligence.
And how much are we talking about, Mr. Clarke?
Pennies, relatively.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars?
Some of it cost hundreds of thousands. The whole program was in the low millions, I think. In any event, this slowed things down, obviously. Mr. Berger took up my cause with the Director of Central Intelligence and got their agreement that they would fly the reconnaissance version. It was flown in September and October of 2000, 11 flights. And the Directorate of Operations put a lot of restrictions on those flights, in part because they were afraid that the aircraft would be shot down and they would have to pay for it. I tried to point out that even if the aircraft were shot down, the pilot would return safely to home. But that didn't seem to persuade them. In any event, during those flights, at CIA's insistence, they were designed as a proof of concept operation, meaning that we could not have cruise missiles, other military activity, other covert action capabilities cued to this, so that when the Predator did see bin Laden, as it did, I think, on 3 occasions, but clearly on 1 in that time frame, there were no military assets available. There were no covert action assets available at the insistence of the CIA, because they wanted this only as a proof of concept operation. Fast forward to 2001. The flights had been suspended because of the winter during which they couldn't fly. We then became aware that there was a long-term program in the Air Force to arm the Predator. Johnny Jumper, the head of the Air Force, thought that it might be possible to crash, probably the wrong word, to accelerate this program and arm the Predator right away. General Jumper directed that happen. It happened in a matter of months, not a matter of years, and it appeared to work in tests in the western United States. When on September 4th we held the principals meeting that's been discussed, the issue on the table was, would CIA fly the armed Predator? And CIA took the view in the principals meeting that it was not their job to fly armed UAVs. And they did not want to fly the armed Predator under their authority. I was informed by people who were in the CIA that during the discussions inside CIA, people in the Directorate of Operations had raised objections, saying, for example, that if CIA flies the armed Predator and it kills bin Laden, then CIA agents all around the world will be at risk of retaliation attack by Al-Qaeda. I didn't think that was a very persuasive reason, because I thought CIA agents were already at risk of attack by Al-Qaeda. In any event, as the September 4th principals meeting ended, CIA had not agreed to fly the mission. September 11th happened. CIA then agreed to fly the armed Predator mission. It went into operation very quickly in Afghanistan. It found the military commander.
Within a month?
I think within a month. It found the military commander of Al-Qaeda, and because it was armed then, it could not only find things, it could kill them. And it launched a missile, a Hellfire missile, at the military commander of Al-Qaeda and killed him and his associates. Hope that answers the question.
That answers the question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Clarke, thank you very much. Thank you not only for your testimony today, but thank you for your extraordinary time you spent already with the Commission and your willingness to help us with our report.